Good morning, everyone. I will now call this meeting of the BioGRID Joint Board of Management to order at 9:01 a.m. And we'll start with the land acknowledgement. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Anishinaabe, the people of the Three Fires known as Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi Nation, who have inhabited this land from time immemorial. And further give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. We also recognize the Métis and Inuit whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. May we all, as treaty people, live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all its diverse peoples. Next item is approval of the agenda or additions to the agenda. Are there any additions to the agenda today? Seeing none, could I have a mover and seconder to approve the agenda as presented? Harry and Grant, is there any discussion? I will call the vote. All in favor? That is carried. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, you may declare at any time if one should arise. Minutes of the previous meetings. The recommendation is that the minutes of the BioGRID Joint Board of Management held on December 7th, 2023 meeting be approved. Could I have a mover and a seconder? Scott? Brent? Any discussion? All in favor? That is carried. We have no delegations, and the next item is our 2023 audit planning letter. The recommendation being that the 2023 audit letter and draft financial statements prepared by BDO Canada LLP be received for information. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Harry? Scott? And I will turn it over to Tracy now to speak.
I need to be green and red, okay? Usually it's just green for go. Usually it's red for stop. All right. I'd like to thank the committee for having me here this morning, and I'd also like to thank Samantha for all her help in getting the audit pulled together. So the report in your package contains all the required communications for the board. It's similar year to year, and since I'll be here 3 times this year, this is the first one, but I still will just do a brief overview of the communication part of the communication. The financial statements are in drafts, so they need approval from the board before we can release them in final. We are required to declare to you that we are independent on an annual basis. Materiality was 13,500. Unadjusted differences are identified during the audit are on page 5. They are small, so they are not material. So we have not requested them to be adjusted. So you'll find those on page 5. And in terms of internal control issues, there are no issues with the controls that we tested during the audit. However, there is a qualification in the audit report, the same as it has been for a number of years, relating to the revenue completeness of the tipping fees. So we're unable to audit that part. So that's the same as it's been in the prior years. So that's the summary at a glance of the communication. Any questions on that before we look at the actual numbers? Okay. So our qualified opinion is on page 2 of the financial statements, and you'll find those in the appendix. So in the second paragraph is our opinion. In our opinion, except for the qualification that over the completeness of revenue, the financial statements present fairly in all material respects. The position of the biodigester in with Canadian public sector accounting standards. So the qualification is in the third paragraph. Inherent in their nature, tipping and sewage fees are not susceptible to complete audit verification. Accordingly, our verification of these fees are limited to the amounts recorded in the records of the biodigester. On page 5 is the statement of financial position, or the balance sheet. So this is at a point in time. So this is as of December 31st of 2023, which is the year end. On December 31st, 2023, the biodigester had cash of 454,000. However, that might sound like a lot, but if you look at the liabilities section, your liabilities were 509,000. So there wasn't actually enough cash to cover all of the liabilities. The future capital receivables of 238,988 are owing to the biodigester by each of Georgian Bluffs and Chatsworth. There have been no capital levies in the last few years and no capital expenses. So these amounts, the future capital and the capital reserve hasn't changed for the last few years. So although you're not required to cash flow those receivables until the reserve is used. The reserve is reflected as part of the biodigester in the accumulated surplus. In the liability section, there is $75,000 owing back to the municipalities for amounts loaned to the biodigester for operating cash flows. And there's also 278,000 owing to Georgian Bluffs for expenses paid on behalf of the biodigester. So therefore, the net amount owing to the biodigester by Chatsworth is 163,988, and the biodigester owes Georgian Bluffs 114,394. The accumulated surplus is made up of 2.3 million in tangible capital assets, the capital reserve that we talked about of 477,000, and an accumulated deficit of 17,177. So on the next page is page 6, and it's the revenues and the expenses for the year. As I said, there was no capital contributions and no capital expenses. Therefore, all these revenues and expenses relate to the operations, except for the $145,000 in amortization. So the annual surplus reported on this page of a deficit of 55,067 is almost the same as the operating surplus if you add back the amortization. So on the next page, we take the 55,000 annual deficit, add back that amortization, and you get to 89,933. So the biodigester did have a surplus in operations for 2023. So the surplus of 89,933 has been applied against the prior year deficit that had been carrying forward. And so there was a deficit of 107,000 being carried forward. So that's where you end the year in 2023 with an accumulated deficit of 17,177 still to fund by the municipalities. Appendix B does provide details of those operating surpluses over the formation of the board. So it gives you more details on that. And that is a very high level overview. So any questions?
Any questions from the board? I'm not seeing any. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. So with no further discussion, I will call the vote on that item. All in favor? It's carried. So we have no staff reports, no unfinished business, no new business, no closed session. Goodbye, Tracy. And the date of the next regular meeting will be determined as needed. So if there's no further business, I will now call for an adjournment of this meeting. Yes. That's okay. I had actually been thinking of that myself, so I just followed the script.
To Mayor Carlton, to members of the board, good morning. Chair Carlton this morning, to members of the board, good morning. I'd have been surprised if we got out of here without that one. Yeah, it's a good question. So Paddy and I had a quick conflab there. This is a long microphone. To work out who was going to answer this one. I'll take this one on. We haven't managed to do what we said we were going to do, which was we had hoped to at this point have a joint councils meeting. We haven't got there, and that is simply the pressure of time that has, I think, Paddy, CAO in Chatsworth has had a fairly full plate, and I know I've had a fairly full plate, and this one just is one that has slipped slightly in terms of work planning. We have had initial conversations with Aqua to pull together the data and information and costs that would be associated to the next steps based on the discussion of the board and direction of the board, so that we can fully understand what a full cessation of operations and walking away from the biodigester part of the site would look like, as well as some small but important capital upgrades to the lagoon facility to enable for more reliable access to the top of site delivery and a better access road into the lagoon facility for year-round use and maintenance. So we have reached out to Aqua. We do have some initial feedback from them as to what that would look like. We just haven't had a chance to pull that together into a report and arrange a joint boards meeting, so joint council meeting. So I would anticipate definitely before the end of the year, and I suspect just after the summer break, we should be able to pull together a joint councils meeting to discuss next steps in respect to the biodigester. And the board has my apologies that it didn't happen today.
Everyone's okay with that, and we're probably looking at what, September-ish? Okay, good. So I will now call for adjournment. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Grant and Harry. All in favor? Harry, thank you.